Hello, I'm George Listencier. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. All wars claim victims beyond the battlefield. Iraq is no different. To the legion of those maimed by combat can be added the ever-growing numbers of those whose lives are so diminished by the conflict that their personal struggle is aimed at reclaiming whatever decency and sanity can be claimed in an insecure and violent environment. For the women of Iraq, the war is a daily presence, one that has eroded many of the gains they once enjoyed and left them fighting for a hopeful future amid the turmoil and confusion of a very dangerous present. My guest is Christina Asquith, journalist and senior editor of Diverse magazine. She's currently at work on a book based upon the plight of women in Iraq. Christina, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a delight. And I should also add that the book is clearly based also upon the extensive work you've done as a correspondent in Iraq since the invasion of 2003. In order to get focused on women in the present, Christina, and future prospects, maybe we should turn to the past first.
Okay.
Because I think it could be safely said it's kind of a cruel irony that in many ways the past was better for women in Iraq than today is. And by that I mean going back to the early parts of the 20th century. I know, for example, that by 1923 there was a women's organization called Women Awakening in the country. How would you characterize the early and mid-century, 20th century for women in Iraq?
Well, Iraqi women have always prided themselves on being the most progressive, the most liberal, some of the most educated and outspoken in the Middle East. They made tremendous gains under the early years of the Ba'ath Party, which was essentially a socialist party.
Right.
So it was not unusual to see women in university laboratories, in political positions as engineers, as lawyers, and they were very, very well read and had all sorts of freedoms, which is not what you think of when you think of the Arab world in the Middle East.
And how had they gotten those largely because of their own, as suggested by that organization, their own mobilization, their own efforts, or were the Communist Party and other political organizations supporting women's rights in the early years?
The Communist Party and the Socialist Party were supporting and encouraging women's rights, and also there's a long tradition of education and of women's rights and a strong Arab women in Iraq. And what I think made the difference for them is that they didn't face the rise of Islamism that some of the other countries faced in the 60s and 70s with Arab nationalism. Saddam kept down efforts by the clergy to take control. So it was more like they were spared, anti-women activities.
I see. So that created an environment in which they could progress as they did.
Yeah, that and Saddam's political position was one which encouraged women. Of course, the Iran-Iraq War through the 80s also took away a lot of men, so it opened up jobs for women, much like World War II did for American women.
Exactly. It's interesting. My familiarity with all of this is obviously very cursory, but I came across a couple of interesting facts that prior to Saddam, well, way back in the 40s, when there was the beginning of the revolt against the monarchy that existed, the women were very active in that in 1948, which is something I mean, today when I see political protests in the Middle East, I rarely see women in the streets.
Well, as an Arab woman would quickly correct you, while they're not in the streets, they do say that they're protesting, and they think of themselves as protesting through writing, through meeting in the house, through supporting in what ways they can. They're not as visual, but they would say that they're as strongly active as any man. And certainly if you get engaged in a debate or discussion with them, you will realize that they are not the oppressed as they appear to be under a burqa.
It's interesting you should say that, because another phrase that I ran across comes back to me now because of your answer, that the women of Iraq have never considered themselves, quote, passive victims.
No, I certainly couldn't. From the women that I know they wouldn't. It's hard to generalize about an entire region, but certainly not.
How would you, I mean, if we look at this long history of their activism and focus particularly on the Saddam years, the years in which, now this I think creates a kind of to my mind, very puzzling dilemma. On the one hand, you have a dictator who's one of the cruelest and most repressive the region has known. But then he's sitting atop something called the Ba'ath Party, which seems to be all-embracing and massive. And I guess I'm wondering, Christina, is in that environment where you have this great cadre of professional women. How were they able to advance in those years? Was the Ba'ath Party a medium in which they could, even under a repressive dictator, you know, get prominent careers?
Certainly. I mean, it is layered, and I often find myself, when I'm saying good things about what women were like, reminding myself that I am talking about Saddam Hussein's era, which was kind to no one. And what Iraqis often say is that we had women's rights, but we had no human rights. And it was a trade-off in that respect.
Right.
You know, if you joined the Ba'ath Party, male or female, you could advance very quickly.
Right.
If you didn't join the Ba'ath Party, the opposite. And whether you were male or female, I think it was just a situation where being a woman didn't really help or hurt you particularly.
And were women prominent within the Ba'ath Party? I mean, in terms of numbers, positions, influence, that kind of thing?
Not strikingly, but they were there. Yeah.
They were there.
I mean, they don't. I think Saddam had one woman in his cabinet, not more.
One other fact about this, and of course this relates directly to the Saddam years and brings us right up to the point where you began to get interested in this story that you're developing. By my calculation, Christina, and admittedly my math is not my most powerful gift, but it looks to me like a quarter century of warfare for Iraq. And this, of course, begins with the Iran-Iraq War, which was devastating for the country. Now, I've heard conflicting reports on this about how this affected women in particular. It affected everyone, obviously. One report that I've heard, I'd love to get you to comment on, was that women had been enjoying a largely progressive environment up to that point, but that the war and the demands of the war created an atmosphere in which Saddam did two things that they found restrictive. One is that he began to emphasize the religious card to sort of make sure that sector was firmly under control. And that, of course, has implications for women. And the second was he or his cohorts began to kind of emphasize the, quote, women as homebodies, providers of population for this machine that was just sort of consuming everyone in warfare. Does that make sense? In other words, it was a setback era for women in particular for those reasons.
I think the 80s was probably, women were still doing all right. I mean, they suffered under the war, probably the most significant way in which they lost their husbands, their brothers, their sons. And a woman who becomes a so-called spinster or a widow in Iraq has all sorts of stigmas attached to her. There's economic ramifications. It's not as, I guess, simple as being a single woman in America. And so there was that problem, but the resurfacing of religion in Iraq didn't really happen to the 90s. And in fact, while they were at war with in the 80s with Iran, Saddam actually really clamped down on any symbols or any signs of religious affiliation, because of course the Iranians, being Shia, were considered a threat to him. So women were very discouraged from veiling. And it wasn't until the 90s, really, when he was suffering in a third war that we haven't mentioned, which was the sanctions, which devastated Iraqis. I mean, just looking at infant mortality from the 80s to the 90s, you can see the effects of these sanctions. It really flattened and leveled the country in a very heartfelt way. And so that was when you saw Saddam cling to the clerics as an effort to shore up his power. And also people were just so desperate, a lot of them turned to the Quran and turned to religion.
So the appeal to the clerics, so to speak, came in the 90s, in the era of the sanctions.
Right.
And was there a ramification of that for women in particular?
Yeah, there was. I mean, the women, they were they were not so much forced to veil. I think they were encouraged to veil. There was some legislation that he passed in 1991 supposedly to appease the clerics, which allowed honor killing, or rather removed any punishment against men who killed their sisters or their mothers as an act to restore honor to the family. Oftentimes because she had been raped and the blame was laid on her doorstep. So there was that. There were also a series of divorce laws that he had enacted early in the in his time in power in the 70s and 80s to empower women to get divorces, to retain custody, to retain levels of inheritance in the house, and he repealed all those laws. So he started taking the country backwards.
This is very, very important stuff, Christina, and it underscores the kinds of things that will be themes treated in the book that you're writing, which you're going to get to in just about one moment. But let me ask one further question on this, just to bring us up to the moment and the kinds of problems that women today are facing, then will be, of course, discussed in your book. I guess, to put it bluntly, what are those problems? I mean, I've thought myself that women clearly face the problems everyone else faces. That is the lack of security, the lack of basic services. But as you just mentioned a moment ago, honor killings, sexual trafficking, kidnapping. It would seem to me there are two classes, if you will, or at least two categories of problems women face.
Yeah, no, that I would put it just like that. I mean, everyone in Iraq is suffering, but women's suffering is no worse or no less, but they are suffering in a different way. And mostly I would say the most significant way is that they have completely lost their freedom. While men can go out into the street, they can go shopping, go to school, work, and they do run the risk of bomb attacks or snipers or kidnappings. They aren't being targeted just because they're men, like women are being targeted. All women now have to veil, just out of the kinds of fear that they may run into an Islamist or an Al-Qaeda or an insurgent who thinks that it's haram, you know, shameful for a woman not to veil. And about 2 years ago, a friend of mine, an Iraqi woman, was walking through the marketplace with her scarf off, and she was hit in the breast with a pebble that someone had, you know, shot from a slingshot. That was 2 years ago. Now they're using guns, and it's been an escalation, and women are being, in some cases, kidnapped, and they're found beheaded on the side of the road, and their head has been wrapped in a scarf, and there's notes pinned saying, you know, this was because this woman hasn't veiled. So the war and the lack of security opened up the floodgates to all sorts of criminal elements to come in, and one of those criminal elements are the Islamists.
So, I mean, this is just, it's stunning just to
It
hear,
is. It's hard to imagine.
Well, it's very hard to imagine, and that's one of the good things about having you here, because as someone who, from this side of the world, who can hear things like that, I mean, I'm just, and I'm sure anyone watching us right now is stunned by it. And one immediate question, and since you have been on the ground with this so long, is, I almost, excuse me if even the phrasing is awkward, but what kind of normalcy is possible? I mean, what can women, how does a woman relate or deal with a situation like this on a daily basis, particularly women who have gained you know, their professional standing, who have their own intellectual interests, who have been used to living lives that are embody both the home and the career and the rest of it. I mean,
and they're suffering tremendously. Their lives are confined to the four walls in their room. My one friend has satellite television now for the first time, my Iraqi friend, she's 22, and we joke and say she watches Friends, and we say, your room is like this sitcom, your life is like this sitcom, it happens in only 2 rooms. And that's really what it's like. She has her living room and her bedroom, and she never goes out. You're seeing a huge increase in the number of women and men taking drugs like codeine or Valium or I forgot the other one, but it's just any sort of kind of Valium to comfort them. There's just a big addiction problem right now. There's higher suicide. Families are breaking up. Families are fighting all the time. They fight constantly over things like the remote. I mean, but it's like their frustrations just pour out over these tiny little things. There's the post-traumatic stress is enormous on them, and you know, I think a lot of them really think it might be worse to live than it would be to die.
Well, that's a striking statement, Christina. I deeply appreciate this kind of reportage. I mean, this vividly brings it home to us here. It's just, as I've used the word stunning, I just have to use it again. As I mentioned at the outset of the program, this is the very kind of thing that has led to the book that you're writing, which deals with 4 women in particular. And let's turn to that right now, Christina. A Spinster's War, what is the title of it?
It's the tentative title is A Spinster's War, Women in Iraq.
And how would you characterize the theme and purpose? Why did you choose to write this book at this time?
Well, because I spent 2 years in Iraq, and what I found was that, well, first off, I was one of the very few female correspondents among the pool of foreign reporters. And the second was I found that no one was really covering the effect of the war on women. I had specific or exclusive access to women, because when I would go to houses of people, translators, Iraqi friends for dinner, all the women, if the man was there, women would hide in the kitchen. But if it was just me, they would come out and they would talk to me, and they were so hungry to tell me their stories. And I looked at some of the ways I mentioned earlier that women are being affected by war. Rape is a tool of war, and you know, women are kidnapped and they're raped in revenge to get against.
And there's an added horror: the honor killings can follow the rape. I mean, it's like double jeopardy.
Exactly, exactly. You know, they're suffering because they can't get married, because they can't leave their house, they have no freedom. So I guess, you know, I felt horrible for them. I really felt the pain and the suffering that they were going through, and that no one was knowing knowing or hearing about it. And I thought, I guess the least that I could do would be to cover this and cover it in an intimate and emotional way.
Well, quite frankly, your emotional commitment to it comes through right now. I mean, you can tell this.
It's hard to talk about sometimes.
Yeah, but I can sense your sense of mission for this. About the book itself, Christina, I know that you're going to deal with a series of women as characters, real women, of course, but as sort of people carrying us through the book. The first of these, I believe, is an American woman. Would tell us a bit about her.
Sure. I chose to follow 4 women so I could try and give an overall picture of the American experience in Iraq. And the first woman is an American soldier. She's a very educated woman. She's been to, has her master's degree from SAIS. She's worked in the OMB here in Washington. And she shocked everyone by joining up to be a reservist just before the war began, because she sincerely believes that in nation building and that Saddam was a horror and a stain and a humiliation to the Americans.
Even with all the problems with the nation, I mean the war?
Well, this is all before the war, when she decided to, she's felt that we had a moral mission to overthrow that kind of dictator. And so that's why she went into Iraq, and she was exactly the kind of person that the Americans wanted in Iraq.
She went as a member of the military?
As a member of the military, yeah. And she was a reservist, and so she went over there to build hearts and minds, and she started out by doing food, delivering food baskets, and then she got into women's rights. And she worked as a liaison between the Iraqi women and the American government to try and start women's conferences, build a shelter, empower women, promote legislation.
Now, all of this she did while she was on assignment in the military? She
eventually transferred from the military over to the civilian administration.
And has remained in Iraq with this sort of thing?
She remained until early 2006.
And tell us a bit about this. When you use the word shelter, is that a place of refuge for women that are battered, or what was it?
It started out as the idea is to be a place for women to escape honor killings and women who had been abused and had nowhere to go. That was, much to her surprise, carried such a stigma in Iraq that she couldn't even get support from women's groups to do that. They said, don't touch this, it's going to inflame the clerics, it's going to create a backlash. Let's start with something slower, let's just go step by step. So a women's shelter became a women's center. And it became a place where they had computers, they could learn job skills, they did try to do a little bit of democracy training. It was like a networking center. It was a physical building.
Right. And what degree of support do you think she got from Iraqi women in doing this? I mean, was it?
Oh, she got a tremendous amount of respect and support. There was suspicions initially, some suspicions, mostly from the men. But once she made that face-to-face contact, which she was good at doing because she spoke Arabic, she was able to break down those walls and find that she had a lot in common. I mean, the men, when they heard that the women could be trained, they could be another breadwinner, most times they really supported it.
That's very encouraging. And I like that example of a personal commitment. It's really quite impressive. I know another of the women in this book is actually...
If we could, before we move on, I think what's important is that how her story ends, however, is in disillusion with what happens to her effort. I mean, she goes over there with all the right ideas, and you watch how her efforts are dismantled and destroyed step by step because of the mistakes made by the Americans, because of the rise of the insurgency, the failure to secure the country. So she ends up leaving Iraq feeling deeply disillusioned with the very Wilsonian idea that she went in there, which was that Americans can nation build, they can bring democracy to this country. So I think she's an important example of where that idea went wrong.
I'm glad you added that. The second of the women in your book actually is from this area, is she not? From Washington?
Yes.
Tell us a bit about her.
Her name's Manal Omar, and she worked for Women International, which is a big women's rights organization in Washington, D.C. She's Palestinian American. She grew up in South Carolina to Palestinian parents, and she went over to Iraq to try and help women, to try and support them in whatever way that she could.
And this is on her own initiative?
Well, under the auspices of Women for Women.
Okay.
Yeah.
And help them in what way? I mean, what did she done?
She was kind of an every woman. She supported the soldier in building the women's shelters. She also tried to support the political women in terms of getting a quota for women in government, which was something that the Iraqi women wanted very much. Surprisingly, Americans were against it. The Iraqi women wanted a 30% quota in the new Iraqi government of women. So this was something that Manal helped them with. She lobbied inside the Green Zone. She came back to Washington, D.C. and lobbied senators and Congress people on Capitol Hill, and she was a go-between for them.
Now I know I must ask, in terms of the first example where we saw a disillusionment at the end, what is the outcome in her case, or do we know it yet?
You know, Manal is a fighter, and she is a way forward for women in Islam, I believe. She is a devoted Shia. She's, a devoted Sunni. She believes, you know, she prays daily, she veils, she reads the Quran, and she is also considers herself a feminist. She's an athlete. She wears a burkini, which is like a Muslim bathing suit that covers your body. So she swims. She encourages Muslim women to be active. She encourages them to have careers and to have, you know, interests. And so she, to me and to all the Iraqi women that she met, was a model for a way forward, a way to retain their faith, but also.
Right, right. She remains engaged in all these things.
Yeah, she does. She works a lot in, she's with Oxfam now. She works a lot in Palestine. And
I'm getting the impression, as I listen to you, Christina, that she might be, you tell me, particularly effective among younger women?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in a lot of cases, they've never been exposed to someone. They've always felt like it was a trade-off. Either you have your faith, or you have women's rights and a career. And Manal was a way forward. She is a way to bring those two ideas together.
So the biggest part, or at least one of the big parts of what she does, is her own example.
It is, and not only to Iraqi women, but also to a lot of the clerics, because they would say, you know, they would come to her with these ideas that all Americans, women are prostitutes. And, you know, here she was a woman, she's very outspoken, very articulate. She uses examples from the Quran to make her point, talking about the Prophet's wife, how she was a businesswoman.
Right.
And she's very convincing, and I've never seen her leave a conversation with a cleric and not have him convinced that there is a way forward for women in Islam, and specifically in Iraq.
She's been that persuasive with the clerics. I mean, my image of the clerics, at least some of them, is that's a pretty hard thing to pull off.
Well, you know, they say things to her like, "Why are you wearing pants?" I mean, she gets these kind of these questions, like they try and question her commitment to Islam. But she's effective. She's more effective than I think a Western woman can be, because, like I said, she does veil. They can't question her faith.
Right, right. She's got the bona fides, so to speak.
Yeah, and of course there's a long history of writing and literature in Islam which says that there's no reason why women shouldn't have all the freedoms and the rights and that we think that we have in America.
That's very true, and that's one of the things that I've learned to my own benefit just in doing these programs, that this mischaracterization of Islam is one of the biggest problems. Two sisters to complete the cast of characters, 118 and 121. They're both Iraqis, is that right?
Yes. I met them early on, and they are very kind of average Iraqis. They're both college-educated young women. They were coming into their own, I suppose, when the war began. One had just graduated from college, the other was just beginning, and they very much believed that they were going to be this blessed generation that would grow up without the weight of Saddam's presence, and in this new Iraq, in this democracy with freedom. One of them, the older one, goes to work for the Americans. She really supports the mission. And the younger one goes to college and tries to get her degree. Right.
And these are stories that are ongoing, of course. You're in touch with them.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, one of them is here now in America. And you know, the purpose of bringing them into the story is to show what happened in Iraq. You know, it wasn't just overnight the American occupation failed and the insurgents arose. There was a step-by-step process, a series of mistakes, and these women, they'll astound you with what they've gone through.
This is a good point. Going back, and it reminds me of the first person we spoke about in your book and her disillusionment at the end with what had gone on. One of the things I began to suspect as I read to prepare for our conversation is that there's a perhaps even very strong degree of disappointment, perhaps best said, with American policies toward women's issues in Iraq, that some of the things that we set out as matters of policy simply haven't worked or have actually been regressive. Is that a fair statement, or?
I think it is a fair statement. I think, you know, what doomed the women's liberation and the women's efforts in Iraq was really the overall policies, the bigger mistakes, the lack of securing the borders, the political breakdown. There wasn't so much a failure of effort or mistakes being made by the Americans specifically towards women's rights. I mean, the Americans, they supported women's rights. I think the activists would say they could have done more, and they should have done more.
But is that an example you cited a few minutes ago about Iraqi women feeling that getting a quota for the parliament was a good thing, Americans not necessarily seeing it, suggests that maybe our antennae weren't always as sharp as they could be?
You know, it's hard to get into people's motivations, but I do know the Republican Party is against quotas point blank, and I think
but
that
that's
might
an American. That's for, you know, that's here.
Right, right, of course, I know. Well, the Iraqi women did win the quota in the end, so the Americans backed down.
Which brings up the obvious question of what are the right ways for Americans to relate to all of this, to be helpful to Iraqi women. I think, and I guess we would have to introduce the word feminism into this right now. I mean, how should anyone in this country, well disposed to the plight of women in Iraq, act?
Well, the first thing is I think they should know that the Iraqi women supported the Americans in the beginning, and they really did. And the women in my book, they call the American soldiers their heroes. And they had a tremendous amount of faith and hope for what the Americans were going to do for them. And the second thing is really that they want the same things that American women want for the most part. They want freedom, they worry about their children, they want to be in love, they want to be married and see their grandchildren grow up, and a lot of them want careers. I mean, they really do, and that's the one thing I hope I get across in my book, is that these women are not Iraqis, they're not statistics or numbers, they're friends, and they have dreams, and they're also, because they wear a scarf or a burqa, it doesn't mean that they're uneducated.
One of the things that comes through just listening to you, and I think it'll be in the book as well, a strong part of the book, these are not exotic creatures. These are human beings who have aspirations like anybody else, who just want to live lives to the fullest.
They do, and their strength in all, and their courage in all of this is something I question every day if I would have that to go through what they're going through. And it's brought them together as mothers and sisters and daughters and mothers. The bond is incredible. Their spirit has not died, even though they've been, the younger one has been in the house for almost 3 years now, and she keeps a journal, which I read, so I see what she does on a daily basis. And it could crush anyone, but they're still strong, and I hope it all works out for them in the end.
I do too, and I look forward to the book, and I don't know what I would do under those circumstances either, but A Spinster's War is forthcoming. I want to have you back when the book is out.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue's also on the MHC Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhcworldview.org. Please join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching this week. Christina, thank you. That was wonderful.
That's all right.